Todd Hennessy is here with us. He is with the Colorado Holocaust Educators. Todd has spent much of his career in education, and among his many accomplishments, he was named a museum teacher fellow with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Next to Todd is Pamela Roth. Pamela is the youngest daughter of 5 children born to Holocaust survivors. Her parents were only 12 years old when the war broke out and changed their lives forever. Pamela is here tonight to honor her parents, and particularly her father, who spent many years visiting classrooms and educating our community to ensure that the history of the Holocaust was never forgotten or rewritten. Pamela has made it her mission to become her father's voice. Next to Pamela is Dr. Adam Rovner. He's an associate professor of education and Jewish literature and the director of the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver, where he's taught since 2008. He is an author, and his articles have appeared in numerous outlets in the U.S. and abroad. Next, I skipped over Estelle. It's okay. Estelle Nadel is with us next to Pamela. Estelle is a remarkable woman, to say the least. She is a Holocaust survivor. Estelle was only 7 years old when her sister, her brother, and her father were sent to Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. And the members of her family were killed in the gas chambers. But she and her brother were later jailed, and then they managed to escape through a window in their cell. Once free, Estelle and her brother lived in hiding in an attic over a stable for 2 years and ultimately arrived in the United States in 1947. Estelle is now 87 years young and lives in Colorado, sharing her story of survival. As a witness to the Holocaust horror, she feels it's her duty to stand up to those who deny that it happened. And on the end is Stacey Shagaya. She is a native Coloradan, and she serves as the program director for the Sakura Foundation. The mission of the foundation is to establish connections that celebrate and share Japanese and Japanese American culture. Stacey is the daughter of the daughter of 2 World War II concentration camp internees. She strongly believes in standing up for those who are underserved and experience discrimination in order to build a more compassionate community. And lastly, I would like to introduce Dr. Dan Lesham. He is here to facilitate our panel. Dr. Dan, he said I could call him that, is currently the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council at Jewish Colorado. Dr. Lesham has held several key leadership roles at organizations and institutions across the country that work on behalf of the Jewish community. He holds a PhD in Jewish Studies and Comparative Literature, and I will now turn things over to you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. This is nobody's first choice of activity or thought experiment when they wake up first thing in the morning. And yet we find ourselves confronted with these issues that don't seem to be going away. Both literally, you can barely open an edition of the New York Times or the Washington Post, or even recently the Denver Post, without reading news about the Holocaust and tragically about other genocides that are occurring. I worked for many years in Holocaust institutions, and my wife, who in any case is a lovely woman but never understood my anxiety disorders, would say, "What are you so stressed about working on the Holocaust? There are no Holocaust emergencies. It happened. It's in the past." And it's a very reasonable and understandable position to take, and yet somehow and profoundly untrue. So I want to start by actually letting each of our panelists speak to the question of why do we keep talking about, learning about, telling stories about the Holocaust. It's part one of my question. You should never ask multiple part questions, and I apologize, but that's part one. So why do we keep talking about it? And number two, how does this film change the conversation, if it does? What does it add? What were we missing until this film came along? And I'll start with you, Todd.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Why? I'm sorry. Struggling with this because there are so many whys, and I think off the top of my head, the main reason is the individual person, the why. What happened to each individual person? We've grown accustomed, we're conditioned to learn of this number, this large, gigantic number, 6 million. And I think we are doing a wonderful job in the education field at this time to take that really large, unmanageable, unimaginable number and bringing it down to that single number, to that number one, and to talk about each individual person. And so we've gone past the how enormous it was and how tragic it was because of its enormity to now bringing it down to that very small piece of each one of these people was a person and what they contributed and what they could have contributed to their communities, to their countries, to the world in general. And when you talk with survivors, when you learn stories of those that didn't survive, even when you talk with liberators and witnesses and things of that nature, you always hear about more people, and you get their first names and you get their ages and you get their likes, and sometimes you get quirky little stories, and it lets you remember those names. And so a lot of teachers that I see today doing a really good job of challenging their students not to remember this big, enormous number or how many killing centers there were or how many deportations there were from Paris or whatever, X, Y, or Z, but to be able to identify a person or a number of people by name and their experience. So I think that's the why that I think we should still be talking about, and I think we do, at least in the realm that I work in. This film, we were fortunate enough through our association with the Holocaust Museum in DC, started seeing clips of this last spring. And as you can, if you've seen this for the first time, you're going, whoa, that's a lot to unpack. And trust me, we were all saying the same thing, that's a lot to unpack. And there's going to be a lot of teaching to go along with this, which I think is great. There's going to have to be that conversation to go along with that. And so we have the materials put together, and we will have the resources available for classroom teachers, and that discussion is going to happen. But it's going to have to be a real discussion of what took place, not just what we remember. And I know, Dan, you and I have talked about this, and a lot of people talk about this. The U.S. usually comes at this from the liberator side. We were the guys on the white horses with the white hats riding in and rescuing everything, and that's not the case. And so that's going to be part of that narrative now that I think we have to seriously address as well. So.
Excellent, thank you. That was an impossible prompt, and you handled it very well. I appreciate all your comments. Pam?
Again, there are many reasons why, but I think it's really important to remember the Holocaust, it didn't start with the gas chambers. There were many things that led up to the Holocaust long before the gas chambers. Their groundwork was laid out years before 1939. Hitler set in motion a lot of things. He had the Nuremberg laws, the propaganda, the degradation of the Jewish population. He took away their citizenship. He took away their rights. They had nowhere to go. He removed them from their homes. He took away their possessions. You had the Night of Broken Glass. They destroyed the Jewish businesses. The humiliation started in 1939, September 1st. They went into Poland. They invaded Poland. They removed everybody from their homes. My father tells me the story of them taking his family and all the other Jews and the Poles and marching them. They took them to another village. They separated the Poles from the Jewish people. They made the Jewish people bring with them their prayer shawls, their prayer books. And they made them watch as they piled all their belongings, the things that were most important, that identified who they were, their prayer shawls, their books. They threw them in a pile. They set a match to it. They burned this. And all they could do was stand there and watch. They had no choice. Then they took the Jewish men and put some of them on a wagon. They took them from village to village, humiliating them, pulling on their beards, their payas, the sidelocks. They made them collect the garbage, the waste from outhouses, and they paraded them around the villages. My father didn't see his father for another 10 days. They went back to their village of Boleslavitz, and what did they find? A lot of their village was burned to the ground. So they no longer had a home. They had to endure this. My father was 12 years old. It was the last time he saw his family. He spent the rest of his days for 6 years traveling from ghettos to concentration camps, a death march. He finally arrived here in 1949. My mother's story isn't much different. Same thing, she was born in Pabanica. They came in on September 1st, 1939. They ghettoized Pabanica. She had to live in her home with other family members. They had to work. They sewed uniforms. They were taken from Pabanica and sent to Łódź. Both my parents went through Auschwitz. My father weighed 42 pounds when he was liberated. He was 17 years old. My mother and my aunt, the only 2 survivors from their immediate family, they were liberated in Bergen-Belsen. They were 18 years old. Both my parents had to be nursed back to health. They spent time in the hospital. They were malnourished. They didn't have the comforts that you and I have. They had no running water. They weren't free to do anything they wanted. Nourishment consisted of a bowl of watery soup, piece of bread. This is 6 years. Most people can't survive that. Could you survive that? I don't see how I could survive that. But yet they did. And they proved to Hitler they could win. And they did win. And every survivor won. But there's mass graves out there. It's important. We can't forget this. We can't allow history to keep repeating. We have to learn. We have to face those tough questions. We have to face what America did or didn't do. You know, history isn't there for us to like. We have to face it. And we have to teach and keep teaching because the number of survivors is dwindling. I'm fortunate that my parents talked about it, mainly my father. He wrote a book. So my brothers, my sisters, and myself, we are fortunate that we understood from a young age what they went through. We understood that we were different. It was still very hard because I think, even to this day, of all the family I never got to meet, who do I look like? There are no pictures. There are no mementos. I have nothing. I had my mother and I had my father. I have their histories. And I will continue to share their story. And we have to keep learning. We have to teach. We have to educate. I know people that have never heard of the Holocaust. They have no idea. 6 million people, yeah, it's a large number. It is very hard to grasp that concept. But there's so much information out there. There are Holocaust museums. There are still survivors. There are children of survivors. We know their stories. There are so many resources, memoirs written by survivors. We have to read. We have to understand. We have to look at it through their lens, not our lens, because it is ugly. And that mankind can be that ugly. It's true. And it's sad.
Thank you, Pam. Estelle, please, both why do we need to keep learning about the Holocaust and what contribution does this film make? Why is it important?
It's it's very important to be able to speak about it today more so than ever before. Look at what is happening in the world right now. So much anti-Semitism, so much denial that there was a Holocaust. I, as a young person, when I came to the United States, I was 12 and a half years old. When I came to the United States, I wanted to be an American. I didn't want to be identified as a Holocaust survivor. I never spoke about how I survived. My children, when I married and I had children, they knew that I was a survivor, but they never heard my story because I couldn't talk about it. My daughter-in-law, who is here today, she convinced me. She was a teacher in a junior high school. She was a special educations teacher. And she convinced me that one of the history teachers wanted a Holocaust survivor. And that's how I began to speak. She made me go. Yeah. So I started speaking. In California, there were many survivors, so I only spoke to that school. When I came to Colorado, I was convinced by Carol Ward that I need to get out there and speak. She knows everyone in Denver. So she spread the word that I was in the Colorado Hebrew Chorale. And she spread the word that she has a Holocaust survivor. So I started speaking. Today, it's so important, more so than ever. It's very difficult for me to tell you my story because I lost most of my family. But I do it because it's necessary. And everyone here needs to keep doing that, telling the story, telling their children. I tell the students that they're going to be my voice someday and talk about what really happened to me and that there was a Holocaust. So this is very important today.
Estelle, what year was it when you first told your story?
It was, what year was it? Yeah, so
About 40 years.
40 years, yeah. I was in my 40s when I started speaking, yeah.
All right, please.
Sure. Thanks, Stan. I think there's 3 reasons that I can come up with off the top of my head that it's important to keep studying the Holocaust. I think the first thing has to do with the fact that we're not done learning about what happened. And so partially it is to keep learning about it, and we don't want to offer very small, partial answers to very big and important questions, and that's one of the reasons why we keep studying it and speaking about it. I'm speaking, obviously, coming from a university, that's kind of what we do, is we keep talking and studying things. The second point I would say is that we hope that through education that we are helping students, and the student does not have to be a teenager or a 20-something. A student could be anyone who gave up part of their Thursday evening to come to a northwest pocket of Colorado in Denver to a university to engage in this conversation, that we hope that students of whatever age really come to sensitize themselves to what it means to be persecuted and to think twice about how they act towards other peoples, whatever they identify as. They could be Black, they could be Latino, they could be Japanese, they could be queer, and certainly Jewish. But this is not something that I think that only Jews need to learn about. In fact, shockingly, I might say this is maybe not what the Jewish Coloradans here, but I think that the non-Jews need to learn this because most Jews have some familiarity with the topic, even the students of today who are millennials. The third reason is I think that we can help cultivate a measure of resistance, try to educate to help students resist intellectually, spiritually. Hopefully it wouldn't come to that physically, materially, against systems that oppress them, to stand up against that, to help encourage them to refuse to give their consent to those who want to deny them their humanity. And I think that this documentary, while it doesn't provide a great deal of new information, these are stuff that scholars know. It's still very important because most people aren't scholars and they're not reading very long historical tomes to learn about this. This brings it out from college classrooms, from the books, from the libraries, into people's living rooms. And it creates the conversations that we're having right now. I think that's a very important element of the documentaries.
Thank you so much. Stacy, the same question, but I invite you also to reflect on the ways in which the community and the story that's yours and that you represent has different stakes, but still, why learn about the Holocaust? And then the transition, what does it have to tell us about your experience?
Well, first of all, I echo what everyone has said. I do very much appreciate being invited today to represent a slice of the story of the Japanese and Japanese American experience here in the United States. I do also recognize that I am not an expert on the internment. Thank you. I'm not an expert on the internment. I do know my own family history. Both my parents were interned. And I also think it's very important to recognize that there is a big difference between what happened to 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II and the Holocaust. They're both tragic. One is on a very different scale, and I do want to recognize those differences. But I think that the question of why we still tell the stories is that it's so often when we hear about history, we hear about it in grade school and middle school and high school from a book. Sometimes we're fortunate enough to have an engaging teacher who really can relay history in a very engaging manner. Other times, like my experience in high school, it was very dry, very boring, and I thought, you know what, all this stuff happened in the past, why do I need to know it? And the reason why we need to know it is because it repeats itself, and I think we think that that the Jewish experience doesn't have anything to do with the Japanese American experience, but there are so many parallels. And the more we tell our stories as individuals, as Pamela so eloquently did, the more we see the humanity in each other. And that, I think, is one of the very unfortunate things that is happening in today's world with the internet, where you can be anonymous in your comments and unaccountable in your comments. Hearing these stories one-on-one, me being able to look in your eyes, and I admit I'm a little nervous about doing that, but that is the big difference between reading something in a book that's just an overall view of something versus hearing particular stories and being able to make connections with them. And I think that's so important, because I would venture to guess, and I don't want to ask anyone to do it, but if I ask people to raise their hands, how many people learned about the Japanese American internment in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, maybe I could count on two hands people who said, yeah, I learned about it. My kids in high school had less than a half a page in their history books about it. And fortunately, they knew about it. And so because of our family experience. And the other thing too is in the Japanese American diaspora, we're breaking out of it, but we tend to be very quiet. And Asians in general, it's in our history, it's you don't make waves, you keep to yourself, you don't get in other people's business, and you don't have other people get in your business. And so because of that, my parents never told us specifics about their experience. They obviously wanted us to know that what happened to them and that it was awful, and they wanted us to appreciate that. But it was, as Estelle was saying, it was just too hard for them to share their story. And this is where it gets emotional for me, because both my parents have passed. So I feel it's my responsibility to come here today, be vulnerable, share information with you, and learn from everybody else, which I certainly am. I'm so excited to, I don't know if excited is the right word, but to view the rest of the documentary in full, because those experiences are what are hopefully what will make us be a little bit more compassionate towards each other and will prevent horrible atrocities from happening again in the future, because, as Estelle was saying, we're seeing these things happen now, and we need to stop them and learn and connect with each other so that we can be more supportive and have a more compassionate society.
Thank you, Stacy. That's beautiful. Please, Estelle.
I have a point to make. A third of our young middle school children have never heard of the Holocaust. That means the parents are not talking about it, or they have never heard of the Holocaust. So that is so important. Young people have to know. We have to be able to tell them what happened, even if it is painful. Some of the states are passing, they're taking out books out of their libraries. And that it's so sad that is happening. They're taking out a Mouse, which is a Holocaust book. And they're taking out anything that's sad, they don't want their children to know. How sad is that?
Thank you. That's a great point, Estelle. I would like to follow up on a couple of things that different ones of you said in your comments. I'd like to start maybe with you, Adam. In your remarks, you said that one of the reasons we still study the Holocaust is that there are things we still need to learn. So my question for you is, are you thinking about facts, or are you thinking about larger questions of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be human, what it means to be, a member of a society, a community, a culture? What are the things, if you could just name a couple that came to mind as you were saying that, what are the things we still need to learn?
Well, I mean, I don't know what facts we don't know, but I suspect there are facts that we don't know. I think that there are questions of psychology, of motivation, of human relations, of governance, of systems and structures that we need to learn more about on every level. That is why people who engage in Holocaust studies, I know you do yourself, have studied literature and psychology and history and sociology and the law. Those are just things that come to mind. And I suspect that this is something that we will need to engage with to understand how it is that a modern, very cultured, and well-educated group of people managed to enlist hundreds of thousands of other people in the effort to exterminate all the Jews and many other victims of the Holocaust. And I think that that is something that we can't understand. We tend to feel like our education preserves us. We tend to think that being smart is all of a sudden an ethical value, or education, culture, our ethical values. Being a doctor, those are the people we're taught to trust, doctors and police officers, lawyers, legal scholars. Lawyers they're maybe not like, but jurists, right? And that all those groups actively and often very enthusiastically collaborated in this, and not just in Germany, throughout all of occupied Europe.
Excellent. Todd, I wanted to ask you a question. As some of you may know, and as Todd and I have discussed, the state is currently revising its social studies curriculum, which will include the Holocaust and Genocide curriculum, and I am not going to throw it open to that whole big question. But I'm going to ask you two rather narrower questions. Number one, looking and engaging with teachers in Colorado, first question, what do you think are the things they're missing the most? What's lacking for them to be able to do their jobs and to teach the Holocaust? That's question number one, and I'm going to break my rule for a second time. And do you think this film provides anything that they might be able to readily and easily incorporate to help answer any of those, to fill any of those gaps?
Look at all the easy questions. Okay. Being a classroom teacher for years outside of the classroom, now working with classroom teachers, probably the most frequent comment I get is, and this is going to sound strange when I first say this, so let me explain it, is we have enough resources, stop giving us resources. Teach us how to use them. Show us how to incorporate them with other aspects, as Adam mentioned, with literature, with film, with a number of different topics. So yes, there are amazing resources that are out there, books, documentaries, things of that nature, firsthand accounts, eyewitness testimonies, and we can hand those over all day long, and they're readily available. On the CDE website, we have a resource bank. In USHMM alone, I don't even know how many thousands of resources there are now. So the first part is give teachers the opportunity to, pardon the expression, to experiment with the resources in a setting before they take them into the classroom. Just don't hand it to them and say, go. That takes money. Not to put those things on. That takes money to get substitute teachers, to get those teachers out of school and things of that nature. Getting the resources, whether they're online or not, takes money. So this is not about a monetary piece. There's a number of steps that go along with this. But then when you take something like this documentary, as soon as you show it, and those same teachers that said, stop giving us resources, like, I got to use this. And so now the next piece is time. And as wonderful and as amazing and as fruitful as we want this mandate to be, this legislation in Colorado, it does not give time. And as soon as you legislate any piece of history and you make it a requirement, inevitably someone says, then what's coming out? And so we would love to give every classroom teacher the amount of time that they need to teach this history with the resources from start to finish. What part of the history, X, Y, or Z, is going to get taken out of that? The reality is when you look at the state standards, any state standards across this country, depending on how it's set up, there is a finite amount of time to teach this. And the reality is, and this will be part of the reality here in Colorado, is if you meet those standards, you could teach this history in less than an hour. We obviously don't want that. So what do we look at in that case? The really troublesome part, I was a history teacher, social studies teacher in middle school and high school. My standards at the time when I taught, which are different now, my Holocaust unit lasted for 90 minutes so I could meet my standards and move on. The language arts standards was approximately 6 weeks. The current mandate is only in social studies. So we're going to have to be really, really creative with our social studies teachers, our language arts teachers, our foreign language teachers, even our science teachers, having collaborative units to make sure that we can take a social studies standard that may be less than an hour and increase that in other content areas to get a much bigger narrative of this. So on the surface, yes, we've got a mandate, we've got resources, we've got unbelievably gifted, talented, and eager teachers, but there are always, unfortunately, hurdles, and some of those I don't know that we're going to have answers for soon. So.
All right, we got a few questions here from the audience that fall into a couple clusters. We'll see how many of them we can get through. But I'd like to start with Stacy. You spoke to this a little bit, and we can work our way as we go back towards me. Anyone who wants to chime in and help us understand this question from your perspective. But I guess the clearest articulation of this question came from this one card. It's 3 questions, but let me ask the simplest one. What connections, if any, do you see between then and now, meaning between the Holocaust period and American society today? I assume, sorry to put words in your mouth, but you didn't specify, which gives me that freedom. In terms of the act of othering, including LGBTQ people mentioned here explicitly, but I would also say immigrants and refugees, other minority communities, and if it's possible, to other women that are more the majority of our culture. It seems like we're also witnessing certain movements that make women feel like they are not equal participants with equal rights in our society. So what continuities, if any, do you see between the stories we're hearing then and the society we live in now?
Wow, that's a big question. I think one of them is that we think that it only happens to other people. It doesn't have anything to do with us. And so we don't have to care about what happens to that group, the African American group over there and the LGBTQ plus group over here. And I think when you really, when we really sit and think more, it's we're a society. Yes, we're just in Denver, and we may think that we have nothing to do with anybody who lives in other parts of the country. But the more we hold on to that, what we think is reality, which really isn't, then we don't open ourselves up to making those connections with other people and to realizing that if someone is suffering somewhere, we don't even have to be the same gender, the same race, the same sexual orientation, but it matters. It should matter to us. And that, without feeling that connection with other people, we're not going to grow. We're going to continue to be divisive. And I never thought, and I said this back in 2020, in 2021, it's now 2022, I cannot believe how far backward we have gone. And it scares the crap out of me. It really does. And so one of the ways to prevent that divisiveness is for us to take that chance with people who are different, who we think are different from us, and reach out a hand and say, I want to hear your story. Would you like to hear mine? I think we're very different. You're on this side, I'm on this side. But there's got to be something we have in common that can bring us together. And those are the things that are going to be so joyful for us, I feel. I think they're really going to enhance our lives. When this unexpected reality kind of pops up of learning something from someone else that you thought you had nothing in common with, those are the connections I see. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it's a big question.
I am thinking of what is happening today. Let's just call it out. We have an ex-president that is anti-Semitic. He's out there spewing so much dirt. It happened last Saturday. How dare he blames the Jews because they don't want to vote for him. Let's talk about our other lawmakers that are out there saying terrible things about Jews. Those are the poisons that we have today. And that's why we need to be in fear. I am in fear today, more so than ever before. I want you all to be very, know what is happening today and speak out. Because when the Jews were in Europe, when the Jews were in trouble, my father was one of the people that was very religious. He would never fight. He always thought God was going to save us. Nothing would happen to us. We need to speak out. Everyone has to speak out because there's so much anti-Semitism today. I am in fear. I don't know if I answered any of your questions.
My questions are less important than your answer. And I don't know about anyone else in the room, but when a Holocaust survivor says, I am in more fear now than I have been, I don't know if you said ever, it would be hard to imagine that that was the case, but then you have been.
Yes, I've been scared.
Since the war years.
Just being in the United States.
Yeah.
When I came here,
Yeah.
I felt very safe. I could walk in the streets in the evening by myself. I was just 12 and a half years old. Progressively, it got to be scary for young people to walk around in the evening. But I was never frightened like I am today, because history is repeating itself. That is my fear. History is repeating itself.
Yeah. Pam?
So Estelle said that very eloquently, and so I feel the same sentiments. If my parents were alive, I know they would be terrified, because again, this is history repeating itself. I have seen how easily misconceptions can lead to insurmountable damage to other people. Like Hitler, he wanted to persecute the Jewish. He blamed them for everything, for all the ills of Germany. He had to have a scapegoat. The Jewish population became his scapegoat. We are watching our politicians do the same, ex-politicians and current politicians. We are watching them do the same thing today, where Trump says, the American Jews better learn to appreciate me. We are his scapegoat. He can't accept what happened, and he is pulling in all these other people. You bombard people with enough lies, you continue to bombard them, and you can see how they get pulled into these falsehoods. And they're swayed in ways that maybe normally they wouldn't do something. But we're watching it today, and it is terrifying.
It's a really, really interesting place we went to. And I think that it brings to mind the quotes of two Holocaust survivors whose work I find very powerful, and whose names you might be familiar with. But Primo Levi, for example, said that every country must first analyze its own behavior, what it did and did not do in the Holocaust, before it presumes or moves on to judging the actions of any other country. And as someone, I think Todd mentioned, and something that always struck me, even though I'm a scholar of the Holocaust, that one of the first museums built on the National Mall by the federal government was the Holocaust Museum, and not a museum to Native Americans, not a museum to slavery, not a museum to Hiroshima and Nagasaki that still doesn't exist. And why? Because nobody likes stories that implicate themselves. And the movement to legislate our children's feelings so that no teacher can make them feel bad about any aspect of history, from my personal perspective, I speak on my own behalf, the dumbing down and the blinding of American students is not going to lead us anywhere good. So, and Elie Wiesel said at one point that, I'm going to get the quote wrong, and I apologize to the memory of Elie Wiesel, something to the effect of, the silence of our neighbors in the face of our suffering hurt us more and more deeply than the actions of the perpetrators who persecuted us. And I think that one of the questions I got, a few different versions of us, is what practically can we do to stop the trend towards increasingly normalized anti-Semitism and increasingly normalized hate of other groups, including immigrants and refugees, the Black community, on and on and on. We seem to be in a culture, and frankly, the demonizing and othering between the two political parties and the demonizing and the othering that happens at King Soopers over any old thing, right? That this has become our go-to reaction to any type of conflict or really any kind of stress. So I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has any reaction to that jumble of ideas and quotations. or if anyone on the panel has practical ideas. I know that, Estelle, you said speak up and keep watch, remain vigilant. One of the strategies, as you might have heard earlier, I direct the Jewish Community Relations Council for Jewish Colorado. One of our strategies is that in order to protect Jews, the best way you can go about that is to build alliances and partnerships with other minority and targeted communities, whether it's race, religion, identity, that in fact, Jewish communities have a great deal in common with other persecuted groups. And this is how ADL and AJC started in this country. They were civil rights organizations, not just for Jews, because the understanding was that a country that protects minority rights will be a country that is safe for Jews. A country that has democracy is a country that's safe for Jews. So I'm curious for the panelists as a last question, because having run a Holocaust museum for several years, the most common response I would get when people walk through the exhibit was, what should I do now? What do I do? You just exposed me to all that horrific trauma. I'm ready. Tell me what I should do. And I don't know if I was right, but at the time I was convinced that if I tell you what to do, then we haven't learned the lesson of the exhibit you just went through. That yes, we have to learn to sit with feeling uncomfortable so that we can come up with an answer that works for us and that will help shape and change our behavior in the future. But if you could write a prescription for people, what can they do to help improve their schools, their community, their neighborhood? Do we dare say nationally? What's within our power? Estelle, do you have something?
Yeah, the internet is one. We've got to do something about all these young people getting and spewing all of that hatred and spreading it. That's one of the things that we need to do. We need to regulate it.
Other suggestions?
I think it might sound trite, but I would say be kind. And what I mean by that is we all have agency within our own spheres of, our work life, our family, whatever. We all have an opportunity to make a change. When you see a documentary like the one we witnessed today, sometimes we feel like we have no agency. We're just little people in this big, gigantic world and we can't make a difference. But we can all be kind. And one of the ways we can do that is to have patience and grace with other people. And one of my go-to examples is you're in King Soopers, there's somebody in front of you, they might be fiddling with a checkbook that they didn't get out until they got the number of how much they owe, and that you're thinking, oh my gosh, you knew you had to pay. Why didn't you get all that ready? Now I'm sitting here waiting. Does it really make another difference? A difference if it takes 2 more minutes for this person to pay in front of you? You might not have any idea of what's going on in their life. They might have just come back from the hospital, from a diagnosis from a loved one, and they're trying to, buy dinner for their family, and that you don't know what other people are going through is my point. And so if we all are a little more kind, give each other grace, and give ourselves grace, and we're not always going to do the right thing. That's a human condition, but that's okay. Let's just try what we can do in our little spheres every day. One kind thing every day.